The moment the pill hit the floor, the room fell silent. Jarek Langley blinked at the cluster of alien students staring at him, their expressions a mixture of horror and fascination. The pill, a simple, harmless aspirin, rolled to a stop near the foot of the nearest student, a tall, slate-gray being named Vortal. Vortal recoiled as if the tiny white tablet might lunge at him. "You were going to ingest that?" Vortal's voice came out uneven, his 3 fingers tightening around the edge of the metal desk. "It's just aspirin," Jarek said, rubbing his temple. "For headaches, pain relief, nothing toxic." Another student, a spindly insectoid creature named Yuln, leaned forward cautiously. "You consume poisons to dull pain? That is—" He made a chittering noise that Jarek assumed was some sort of distress signal. "That is— Jarek sighed. "It's not poison. It's medicine. It helps with inflammation." Vortal exchanged a look with the others. "You mean to tell us that your species willingly consumes unknown substances that alter bodily processes?" "That's a dramatic way of putting it," Jarek muttered. "But yeah, kind of." The room erupted in a flurry of concerned murmurs. Jarek watched as 2 of the students moved toward the nearest communication panel, likely to report him for suspected self-harm. "Okay, hold on." Jarek stepped in front of them, hands raised. "I'm not poisoning myself, all right? Humans have been using aspirin for centuries. It's safe. Well, mostly safe, unless you take too much." Vortal's eyes widened. "There are limits?" "Of course, everything has limits. You don't drink 20 cups of water in one sitting, either." Yuln's manned face twitched. "Water is not a toxin." "It can be," Jarek pointed out. "If you drink too much, it dilutes your blood and messes with electrolyte balance." The room fell into dead silence again. Jarek groaned. It was going to be one of those days. Before he could attempt another explanation, the door slid open, and a faculty member entered, a broad-shouldered reptilian named Instructor Relkesh. The moment Relkesh saw Jarek standing next to the scattered pill and the shocked expressions of his peers, his eyes narrowed. "Explain," Relkesh demanded. Vortal immediately gestured to the pill. Jarek attempted to consume an unknown chemical substance. "It's aspirin," Jarek grumbled. "For pain relief." Relkesh's gaze locked onto the pill like it was a live grenade. "Is this a common human practice?" "Yes." Jarek threw his hands up. "It's not a big deal." Relkesh picked up the aspirin, turning it over in his thick fingers. "You regularly take foreign substances to alter your biology?" Jarek hesitated, realizing how bad it sounded when put like that. Well, when you put it that way. "Have you built up a resistance?" Relkesh interrupted. "What? No, it just works on pain receptors." Relkesh set the pill down carefully, as if it might combust. "We will need to analyze this." Jarek groaned. "Oh, come on, it's just aspirin. It's not some experimental bioweapon." Yoon still looked horrified. "You mean to tell us your species experiments on itself?" Jarek hesitated. "I mean, kind of? It's called clinical trials." Vortal actually stumbled back, knocking over a chair. "You test unknown substances on your own kind?" "Regulations," Jarek said quickly. "We don't just throw chemicals at people and hope for the best." Relkesh considered him for a long moment. "You will accompany me to the medical wing. Your biology must be analyzed for lingering effects." Jarek groaned, but didn't bother arguing. He knew when he was outnumbered. The medical wing was bright, sterile, and unsurprisingly filled with more aliens staring at him like he was some kind of biochemical hazard. He sat on the examination table while a medical officer, a pale-skinned being named Dr. Velsh, scanned him with a handheld device. "You are not currently experiencing symptoms of poisoning," Velsh said at last, sounding almost disappointed. "Yeah, because it wasn't poison," Jarek muttered. Relkesh, standing nearby, crossed his arms. "We will still need to run further tests to determine if this aspirin has long-term effects." Jarek fought the urge to bang his head against the wall. Velsh ignored him, retrieving a small vial. "We will take a blood sample." Jarek sighed. "Fine, but I better not wake up in a secret lab being dissected." Welsh didn't respond, which did nothing to ease Jarek's nerves. As the medical officer drew his blood, Vortel and Yuln stood by the doorway, still watching him with a mixture of fascination and terror. "So you consume many of these chemical substances?" Vortel asked. "Only when necessary," Jarek said. "Painkillers, antibiotics, vaccines." Yuln audibly gasped. "You willingly introduce pathogens into your body?" Jarek groaned. "It's to build immunity. Do none of you have vaccines?" Vortel shook his head. "Our species rely on genetic adaptation over generations. We do not deliberately infect ourselves." Jarek leaned back, rubbing his face. "Great. So I'm a biochemical freak show." Ralkesh folded his arms. "The concern is not unfounded. If your species regularly alters its biology, there are risks we must consider." "I'm not a walking biohazard," Jarek muttered. Welsh finished drawing his blood, sealing the vial. "We will run full diagnostics. Until then, you are not to ingest further unknown substances." Jarek rolled his eyes. "Noted." As he hopped off the table, the door slid open again. A security officer entered, looking tense. "Instructor Relkesh, we have an urgent situation." Relkesh turned. There was an incident in the engineering bay. A coolant system failure resulted in hazardous exposure. Several crew members are experiencing severe inflammation. Welsh stiffened. "Inflammation? What symptoms?" "Swelling, pressure on internal organs, difficulty moving." Jarek snapped his fingers. "Aspirin could help with that." Welsh and Relkesh turned to him. "Explain," Relkesh said. "Aspirin reduces inflammation," Jarek said. "If they're dealing with swelling that's pressing on organs, it could buy them time." Welsh hesitated. "We do not administer unknown substances." "You already took my blood," Jarek argued. "Test it. If I'm fine, so will they be." Relkesh considered this for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Initiate immediate testing. If confirmed safe, we will distribute accordingly." Jarek exhaled. Finally, some progress. As Welsh rushed to run the analysis, Vortel gave Jarek a long, unreadable look. "If this works, it means you were right." "Yeah, that happens sometimes," Jarek said. "You'll get used to it." Vortel still looked skeptical, but for the first time since the aspirin incident, he didn't look horrified. Jarek would take that as a win. 3 hours later, Jarek stood outside the medical bay, arms crossed as he waited for the results. He could hear the muffled discussions inside Instructor Relkesh, Dr. Velshesh, and a few others debating the merits of administering aspirin to the afflicted crew members. Every now and then a word drifted through the door: metabolic variants, enzymatic compatibility, potential cascading effects. He shook his head. They were making this way too complicated. The door hissed open, and Welsh stepped out, holding a tablet-like device. "Your blood analysis is complete. The substance does not appear to have caused any adverse reactions." "Told you," Jarek said. Relkesh joined them in the corridor. "Preliminary results do not equate to certainty. However, given the urgency of the situation, we will proceed with limited administration under strict supervision." Jarek pushed off the wall. "Great. Where do you keep your aspirin?" Welsh blinked. "We do not possess this. Aspirin." Jarek stared at them. "You mean to tell me, after all that testing, you don't even have any?" Welsh tilted his head. "We lack the means to manufacture it." Jarek sighed. "Luckily, I've got some in my quarters." He turned to leave, but Relkesh grabbed his arm. "You carry multiple doses of this compound?" Jarek frowned. "Yeah, it's a basic first aid item." Relkesh exchanged a glance with Welsh. "You stockpile substances that alter physiological responses?" Jarek pulled his arm free. "It's called being prepared. Now, are we doing this or not?" Minutes later, they arrived at Jarek's quarters. He rummaged through his pack, pulling out a small bottle of aspirin. Welsh took it carefully, as if handling an unknown artifact. He examined the label, then opened the lid and sniffed. "I wouldn't recommend inhaling it," Jarek said. Welsh ignored him, scanning the contents. "We will need to measure a safe dosage." Jarek took the bottle back. "For humans, it's around 325 milligrams per dose. I don't know how that scales to your physiology, but I assume you have something to calculate body weight ratios." Relkej signaled for Welsh to follow. "We will determine a proportional dosage. You will accompany us to the afflicted crew members." Jarek shrugged. "Fine by me." They reached the engineering bay's medical unit, where several crew members were laid out on examination tables. Their limbs were stiff, joints swollen, some struggling to breathe. The attending medics were administering oxygen and fluid replacements, but the swelling showed no sign of subsiding. Welsh adjusted the scanner, then measured out a fraction of an aspirin tablet, dissolving it into a controlled dose. One of the afflicted, a short, copper-skinned officer, watched warily as Welsh approached. "This is an experimental treatment," Welsh said. "Do you consent?" The officer nodded weakly. Welsh administered the solution, then stepped back, monitoring vitals. Jarek crossed his arms. "You should see results in about 20 minutes. Relkesh turned to him. "And if we do not? Then congratulations, you've just proven human medicine doesn't work on your species." They waited. The room remained tense as the minutes passed. 5, then 10, then 15. The officer's breathing steadied. By the 20-minute mark, the swelling had begun to recede. The attending medic's eyes widened. "Inflammation is decreasing." Welsh checked the scanner. "Circulatory pressure is stabilizing." Relkesh observed the data, then nodded. "Continue with controlled administration." Jarek leaned against the nearest console. "You're welcome." The rest of the afflicted crew members received their doses. One by one, their symptoms eased. By the 40-minute mark, all showed measurable improvement. Welsh documented the results, glancing at Jarek. "This compound is remarkably effective." Jarek smirked. "Yeah, that's kind of the point of medicine." Relkesh studied him. "Your species has developed numerous such treatments?" Jarek nodded. "And not just for pain or inflammation. We've got antibiotics, antivirals, surgical procedures, prosthetics." Welsh looked intrigued. "You replace damaged limbs?" Jarek shrugged. "We've been doing that for centuries." Relkesh exchanged a look with Welsh. "We will require further discussion on this matter." Jarek stretched. "You know where to find me." Relkesh's expression remained unreadable. "Indeed we do." As Jarek left the medical unit, he could still hear the murmurs of the medical staff, discussing the implications of what had just happened. He had a feeling this wasn't the last time human medicine would leave them baffled. 2 days later, Jarek found himself standing in the research division's medical lab, surrounded by 3 scientists who had barely stopped staring at him since he arrived. Welsh was there, naturally, along with a shorter, blue-skinned researcher named Ulrin and a tall, rigid-postured scientist named Drolvek. The aspirin incident had clearly sparked something, because the moment the afflicted crew members recovered without complications, the medical division decided they needed a full breakdown of human pharmaceuticals. That meant dragging Jarek in for questioning. Welsh gestured toward a display screen that currently showed a breakdown of aspirin's chemical structure. "We have analyzed the compound extensively. Its effectiveness is undeniable, but its simplicity is what baffles us." Jarek leaned back against the nearest counter. "What do you mean?" Ulrin squinted at the data. "This is a naturally occurring compound, slightly modified for stability. Your species discovered this centuries ago?" Jarek nodded. "Yeah, originally from willow bark." Drolek's posture stiffened. "You derive medicine from a tree?" Jarek sighed. "Are we really doing this again?" "Yes. Plants have medicinal properties. Humans figured that out a long time ago." Welsh exchanged a glance with Ulrin. "And you consume these substances without hesitation?" Jarek crossed his arms. "You saw the results yourself. It works." Drolvek narrowed his eyes. "You experiment with biological manipulation on a scale we find deeply unsettling." Jarek groaned. "We don't just throw random things into our bodies and hope for the best. It's all tested before it's used." Welsh tapped on his tablet. We wish to examine more of your medical supplies. Jarek shrugged. Fine, but I'm not handing over anything strong. You're not ready for that conversation. Ulrin tilted his head. What do you mean? Jarek pulled a small bottle from his pocket and set it on the counter. This is ibuprofen, works like aspirin but a little different. Welsh picked it up, examining the label carefully. You carry multiple medications for similar ailments. Jarek nodded. Different mechanisms, different effects. Some people respond better to one over the other. Drelvek's expression darkened. You adjust treatments based on individual biology? Jarek frowned. Of course we do. What, do you just give the same thing to everyone and hope it works? Ulrin shifted uncomfortably. Our species have standardized medical responses. Variations are rare. Jarek shook his head. That's a terrible system. Welsh tapped something on his device. Your adaptability is concerning. Jarek rolled his eyes. You're welcome, by the way. Drelvek ignored him. We have prepared a list of compounds we wish to analyze. We require samples. Jarek glanced at the list. His eyebrows rose. Yeah, no. Half of these are controlled substances. Welsh frowned. Are they dangerous? Jarek hesitated. More like they require careful dosing. Some of these can be lethal if misused. Drelvek's expression darkened. Your species regularly consumes substances with lethal potential? Jarek groaned. You're really stuck on this, huh? Ulrin tapped his tablet. We must understand the full extent of human medical advancements. Jarek sighed. Fine, I'll give you safe stuff, but you're not getting opioids. Welsh frowned. Opioids? Jarek hesitated. Painkillers. Strong ones. You don't want to mess with them. Drelvik's posture stiffened. Your species has access to substances capable of suppressing extreme pain? Jarek nodded. Yeah, but they're addictive. We don't hand them out casually. Welsh exchanged a look with Ulran. This warrants further analysis. Jarek sighed. I'm starting to regret this. Ulrin studied him. Your species is terrifyingly adaptable. Jarek smirked. Yeah, you'll get used to it. Jarek had barely gotten through breakfast before they dragged him back to the lab. His coffee wasn't even finished when Welsh and Ulrin showed up at his table, both looking far too eager for this early in the morning. They escorted him through the research wing's sterile corridors, past several labs filled with researchers hunched over glowing displays and sealed containment units. Jarek wasn't sure whether to feel honored or concerned that human pharmaceuticals had turned into the most exciting topic on the station. Once inside the lab, Drelvek was already waiting, standing next to a tall containment chamber. The glass shimmered faintly with an internal security field, and inside a series of vials sat neatly arranged on shelves. Jarl recognized his own handwriting on the labels. They'd taken his entire first aid kit. Welsh gestured to the display screen, which now displayed a breakdown of ibuprofen's chemical properties. We have completed preliminary analysis on the second compound you provided. Jarek leaned against the counter. And Ulrin tapped the screen, bringing up another set of data. Its effects are comparable to the previous substance, though it operates through a distinct biochemical pathway. Drelvek didn't look impressed. Your species has developed multiple solutions for the same problem. Jarek shrugged. Different tools for different situations. Welsh folded his hands behind his back. The more we study your medical advancements, the more questions arise. Jarek wasn't sure he liked the way Welsh said that. Ulran pulled up another set of data. We wish to examine additional treatments, particularly those related to immune response and tissue regeneration. Jarek narrowed his eyes. You're talking about antibiotics, aren't you? Drelvek nodded. Bacterial infections are a significant threat in confined environments such as this station. Your species has claimed to possess treatments. Jarek sighed. Yeah, we do, but I'm guessing you don't? Welsh hesitated. We possess sterilization protocols and targeted pathogen suppression, but our methods are not as aggressive as yours. Jarek crossed his arms. Define not as aggressive. Ulrin exchanged a glance with Welsh before answering. In cases of severe bacterial infection, we rely on immune modulation or, in extreme cases, cellular replacement. Jarek blinked. You mean, if someone gets an infection, you just replace the affected tissue? Welsh nodded. It is time-consuming, but effective. Jarek ran a hand down his face. That's insane. You could just take an antibiotic and be fine in a few days. Drolvek's posture stiffened. You are stating that your species can eliminate bacterial infections without invasive intervention? Jarek pointed at the containment chamber. There's a bottle of amoxicillin in there. That stuff alone has saved millions of lives. Welsh retrieved the vial carefully, examining the contents through the glass. And this directly destroys bacteria? Jarek nodded. It disrupts bacterial cell walls, stops them from multiplying. Your body does the rest. Ulrin looked skeptical. You introduce foreign substances to combat microscopic threats? Jarek sighed. It's either that or let the infection spread. What do you do if someone's lungs are infected? Cut them out and grow a new pair? Welsh hesitated. In extreme cases, yes. Jarek stared at them. That's horrifying. Drolvek ignored him. We will require a controlled test. Jarek pointed at him. You are not infecting someone just to see if it works. That's not how this is going to go. Welsh tapped on his device. We have bacterial cultures maintained for research purposes. We will test the compound in vitro. Jarek exhaled. Good, that's fine. They moved to an adjacent lab station, where a sealed containment unit housed several petri dishes. Welsh inserted a small amount of the antibiotic into one of the cultures, then activated the monitoring system. The results didn't take long. Within hours, bacterial growth had stalled in the treated samples, while the untreated cultures continued to spread. Ulrin leaned closer to the display. The effect is immediate. The bacterial replication has ceased entirely. Drolvek studied the data. This could revolutionize containment protocols. Jarek smirked. Yeah, that's kind of why we use them. Welsh didn't look up. We will need further testing to determine biological compatibility. Jarek sighed. You do that. Meanwhile, I'm getting my first aid kit back. Drolvek didn't respond. He was already pulling up more data. Jarek had a feeling this was only the beginning. 4 days after Jarek's impromptu pharmaceutical lecture, he was dragged into another situation, this time in the station's agricultural sector. He hadn't even finished his lunch before Welsh and Ulrin arrived at his table, eyes sharp with urgency. He barely had time to shove the last bite into his mouth before they ushered him down the corridors at an almost alarming pace. When they arrived, the air smelled wrong. Not unpleasant, but strange, like damp earth laced with something metallic. The agricultural bay was massive, filled with rows of hydroponic setups and artificial soil beds. Normally, the place was a quiet hum of maintenance drones and researchers tending to crops. Now, however, a small group of scientists stood clustered around a containment unit, their expressions tense. Welsh directed Jarek toward the sealed chamber, where a collection of plants wilted under harsh ultraviolet lighting. The leaves had turned an unnatural shade of gray, their stems sagging as if drained of life. Something's killing them, Welsh said. Jarek crouched slightly to look at the plants. What changed? Ulrin gestured toward a side console. We introduced a new microbial strain meant to enhance nitrogen fixation. Initial results were promising, but within hours the plants began deteriorating. Jarek exhaled. You accidentally introduced a pathogen. Welsh's expression barely flickered. We accounted for cross-contamination. Well, your accounting sucks. Jarek tapped the glass. This is bacterial wilt. Looks like a pretty aggressive strain. Ulrin's hands tightened behind his back. We need a solution. Jarek glanced at the data feed scrolling on the console. You've already tried antifungal treatments? Welsh nodded. What about adjusting pH levels? No effect. Jarek scratched his jaw. Then you need antibiotics. Ulrin hesitated. We have not tested bacterial suppression in agricultural systems. Yeah, well, you're about to. Jarek turned. Where's your storage for chemical agents? Welsh led him to a supply cabinet, where a variety of nutrient compounds and growth regulators lined the shelves. Jarek scanned the labels before shaking his head. Nothing here that'll help. Ulrin's posture stiffened. You carry antibiotics for plants? Jarek gestured toward himself. I carry antibiotics for me, but it works the same way. Welsh's brow lifted slightly. You intend to use human medicine on our crops? If it works, it works. Jarek pulled a small bottle from his pocket. Streptomycin, broad spectrum, should knock this out before it spreads further. Ulrin studied the label. You are certain of this? Jarek sighed. Nothing in life is certain, but this is your best shot. Welsh retrieved a sterile mixing container. We will prepare a diluted solution. Jarek measured out the dosage, careful not to overdo it. Too much could damage the plants. Too little wouldn't do anything. Once mixed, the solution was fed into the irrigation system, dispersing in a fine mist over the affected crops. They waited. Jarek leaned against a nearby counter, watching as the wilting slowed. The plants weren't perking up instantly, but the spread of the blight had halted. Ulrin checked the monitors. Cellular degradation has ceased. Welsh watched the display in silence for several moments before turning to Jarek. This is the second time human medicine has proven unexpectedly effective. Jarek shrugged. We've been fighting bacteria for a long time. You learn a thing or two. Ulrin considered him. Your species applies the same principles across biological systems. Jarek nodded. Medicine is medicine. You just have to know how to use it. Welsh exhaled. We owe you another debt. Jarek waved a hand. Just keep my lunch break intact next time. Ulrin's lips pressed together. Unlikely. Jarek sighed. Figures. As he left the agricultural bay, he had the distinct feeling this wouldn't be the last time they came knocking.